Ever since the release of Halo Combat Evolved back in 2001, I've wanted to take to the skies in a Pelican as part of a mission. An Easter egg in Halo Reach's New Alexandria gave us a taste of what that might be like, but it wasn't until Halo 4's campaign and the level Shutdown that my dream finally became a reality. Unfortunately, what should have been a rather exciting moment for the series turned out to be something of a damp squib, and in this video, I want to chat about why Shutdown is, I believe, one of Halo's worst missions. In story terms, this level focuses heavily on Master Chief and Cortana's relationship and her impending rampancy, as does much of Halo 4's campaign, opening with a monologue about an artificial sun.
But for all that, I'll never actually know if it looks real, if it feels real. Before this is all over, promise me you'll figure out which one of us is the machine.
I mentioned during my last video covering Reclaimer, which you can watch by clicking the card on screen now, that Chief and Cortana's relationship is the best thing about the game, and this scene is another which further solidifies that for me. Cortana contemplates whether she can truly be considered to be alive, while Master Chief seemingly does his best to avoid engaging her entirely, fiddling with his assault rifle in the background. At surface level, Chief is man and Cortana is machine, but if you judge them solely on their words, or lack of, and actions during this particular scene, you'd be hard-pressed to claim that the Spartan comes off the more human of the pair. I'm sure I'm not the only one who got more than a little excited at the sight of a Pelican rising in the background while Lasky wishes the duo good luck, and after a brief chinwag, you take control of Master Chief in a hangar on board the UNSC Infinity. It is worth noting here that there is a fun little Easter egg you can find during this section if you mercilessly slaughter everyone in the hangar, with Sergeant Johnson appearing as part of the final wave of reinforcements trying to take you down. However, I tried getting him to appear on every difficulty level in the Master Chief collection, and he simply refused to ever enter the fray, so I'm not sure what's happened there or if he's been removed in later versions of the game. Eventually, I gave up trying and dejectedly hopped in the Pelican. Zooming down the tunnel and out into the skies above Requiem is admittedly exhilarating, with the ship's narrow walls making way for an incredible vista, but unfortunately, this is where Shutdown quickly begins to fall apart. The setup for what comes next certainly sounds like it might make for an interesting sequence.
Contact. Didact dead ahead.
How do we get inside those shields?
Marking 2 of the larger facilities on your HUD. They're acting as traffic control for resources moving to and from the satellite. If we disrupt their communications, I can forge an override code and convince it to lower those defenses.
The problem, however, is that this style of mission has already been done before, and better. Something that always surprised me about Halo Reach is that it showcased Bungie's ability to continue to craft a Halo experience packed with plenty of surprises, even when their time with the series was coming to an end. Exodus, for example, finally delivered the level set in a city I'd always wanted. Lone Wolf is an epilogue unlike anything else in the series, and New Alexandria introduces a brand new concept for how a Halo level could be structured. It's that third example that I want to focus on for a moment. If you remember, New Alexandria felt like something quite unique. A lot of your time was spent flying above the titular city as you raced between a trio of locations in a Falcon, destroying Covenant communications jammers. The 3 locations housing the jammers, a hospital, a nightclub, and a penthouse, never changed, but the order you were asked to visit them in would. On top of that, you also had to complete a selection of side objectives in between trips to each of the aforementioned areas, which were selected at random from a pool of 12. If you were playing with 1 or 2 players, you'd have to complete 1 each time, whereas those in squads of 3 or 4 would have to take on 2. Set against the backdrop of a ruined city being glassed by the Covenant, glassing which intensified as you progressed, it was an incredibly memorable mission which clearly demonstrated Bungie's continued capacity to innovate. Regrettably, Shutdown tries to mimic New Alexandria's format to some degree during its own runtime, but removes everything that made Halo Reach's rendition such an engaging experience. While you do still have to make your way to 3 separate locations, and can even choose between which of the first 2 you explore to begin with, any element of randomness has been removed. There are no side missions here either, and the environment you find yourself in doesn't really change at all. During New Alexandria, you never knew quite what was coming next, as you raced between the locations housing the jammers, all the while providing covering fire for troops stranded atop a building, or escorting a ship carrying civilians to safety while everything burned around you. By contrast, during your time in a Pelican during Shutdown, you fly to each location, engage in short-lived aerial encounters, and that's about it. There's no interesting new twist on the format, no new ideas to be found. Indeed, if someone were to describe both missions at a high level, you might think they sound alike, but dig even slightly deeper, and it soon becomes apparent that Halo 4's rendition of Bungie's brilliant New Alexandria is nothing more than a fairly cheap imitation. It must also be said that the Pelican isn't actually much fun to pilot. It has multiple weapons you can use, and it's designed in such a way that multiple people can have fun using it together, but that doesn't mean a whole lot when the combat associated with it is so unexciting. You sort of just hover around and take part in several straightforward encounters which require zero thought, and because the Pelican doesn't have much mobility at all, none of them ever really feel like they move out of first gear. Taking on the indoor parts of Shutdown, your objective is to take down the Didact shields.
This tower's directing traffic to the Didact satellite through a carrier wave generator located somewhere inside. Of course, if Infinity wasn't on its way back to Earth, locating and disabling it would be trivial.
We can handle it.
That's hardly the point, is it?
Again, much like the introduction, there is some intrigue story-wise, with Master Chief somehow being able to hear the Didact.
Give it a second.
The others scatter like embers over sand. Together like various champions.
But the actual gameplay surrounding these brief scenes is, to be frank, pretty painful. My biggest complaint about Halo 4 is its linearity, which permeates the entire game, but even with that being so, developer 343 Industries at least manages to mix things up the majority of the time. The Forerunner structures you often fight your way through aren't particularly visually engaging, but there's usually also a decent amount of non-Forerunner environments to help break everything up. An argument could be made that the Pelican sections interspersed throughout Shutdown are designed to do just that. The problem is that they are, as discussed, something of a step back from Bungie's take on the theme, and they are also very short-lived. This means that you spend most of your time during the mission traipsing around silvery grey, uninspiring areas that are far too cluttered visually, fighting silvery grey, bullet-sponge enemies, and between the two, everything begins to feel extremely repetitive extremely quickly. Of the first 2 areas you can choose to take on once you're airborne, one is a large indoor environment you have to work your way round on foot, and the other features, I'm very sorry to say, a gondola ride. The level design in both is pretty good, with multiple paths snaking across the areas and plenty of verticality you can take advantage of, and in isolation, each I think would be okay if it was implanted into a different mission which included more variety. I cannot stand pretty much any segment which features a slow-moving platform ever since Halo 2 featured about 1,000 of them, but because there are generally a lot less of them in Halo 4, I won't mark 343 down too much for this one, even if it is a bit naff. After completing one of them, you'll probably feel like you've had more than your fair share of battles against Prometheans in Forerunner structures. After finishing a second, your patience will likely be wearing thin, and by the time the third rolls around, you may well begin to wonder whether you've accidentally stumbled into some type of Groundhog Day-esque situation where everything is repeating itself on an endless loop. Some of you might think I'm being overdramatic when I say this, but personally, I don't see much of a difference between Shutdown and infamous Halo Combat Evolved stinker, the Library. Both are comprised mostly of bland, samey areas where everything tends to blend into one, and both ask you to fight your way through hordes of enemies who quickly outstay their welcome. In defense of the Prometheans, they are without doubt a more varied foe than the Flood in the long run, but I've never been convinced that robots or similar are ever as fun to fight in first-person shooters as organic enemies are. That is, of course, just my opinion, and you may love taking down a machine or two. However, in my view, it's always much more satisfying battling battling organic foes. Thankfully, there is some respite towards the end of Shutdown as you're given the opportunity to pilot a Banshee. It's not a section that will blow your mind by any means, although it is definitely the most entertaining part of the level by far, even if it is quite standard fare. You rampage your way across an area that is similarly laid out to the third on-foot section mere moments prior, and it's nice to have some of the power handed back to you after some tough battles previously. Shutdown's ending is a good one. Cortana seems to be well and truly on her last legs.
Tapping into this fire's central net. They're mine. Now to imprison them!
And Master Chief launches himself into mid-air, something of a staple for the series by this point. And with that, we reach the end of Shutdown. Shutdown is an interesting mission to me, as it doesn't do anything terribly, but at the same time, there are few missions in the series I've found it harder to get through. It takes the least interesting parts of 4, namely the Forerunner environments and combat against the Prometheans, and doubles down on both, while also throwing in Pelican sections, which I consider to be quite the letdown, having waited so long for one to be included. In a way, I suppose, it's something of a Halo tradition to feature at least one stinker right towards the end of each game's campaign, with missions like Keys in Combat Evolved, High Charity in 2, Cortana in 3, and so on and so forth, being great examples of Bungie struggling to close their games out on an entirely high note. 343 Industries themselves seem to have fallen into that same trap, and I think we're clearly running out of ideas as they looked to conclude 4. Is Shutdown the worst mission Halo has to offer? Most, I'd guess, will say no, but for a mission which is meant to be building towards an ending crescendo, it's one which, unfortunately, leaves a bit of a sour taste. Thanks for taking the time to check out the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you enjoyed it, I'd be over the moon if you'd consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and fingers crossed, we'll meet again soon.